The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the night, their glare bouncing off the sleek black sedan as it rolled to a stop. Inside the vehicle, Judge Michael Carter inhaled deeply, steadying his nerves. He had spent years presiding over cases, ensuring justice was served. Yet at this moment, none of that mattered. His title, his experience, his unwavering commitment to the law, none of it shielded him from the reality that, to some, he was just a black man in an expensive car. He adjusted his hands, keeping them in plain view on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The protocol was drilled into his subconscious. Move deliberately, avoid sudden motions, comply even when the request feels unjustified. He had advised young men in his community on these very rules, never expecting to find himself adhering to them so rigidly. A firm knock against his window shattered the stillness of the night. Through the glass, he saw Officer Jennifer Rowe, her stance rigid, her face unreadable but for the tension lining her mouth. He pressed the button to lower the window, his expression calm, his heartbeat steady, despite the frustration churning inside him. "License and registration," she demanded, her tone devoid of courtesy. Michael reached slowly into his pocket, retrieving his wallet with deliberate care. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" His voice was even, controlled, the same voice he used to preside over packed courtrooms. Rowe's eyes flicked over his suit, his car, his demeanor. There was something assessing in her gaze, a calculation that had little to do with legal infractions and more with unspoken judgments. "You were driving aggressively back there," she replied, her voice clipped. Michael's brow furrowed. He had obeyed every traffic law, signaled every turn, stayed within the speed limit. He knew what this was. The accusation was vague, unprovable, a manufactured excuse wielded as authority. He handed over his license and registration, watching as she examined them. Then, as she read his name, he saw it. The hesitation, the flicker of disbelief. "Judge Carter," she muttered, the title landing on her tongue with reluctance. Michael met her gaze. "That's correct." A tense silence stretched between them. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, the internal debate between doubling down and backing off. Her hand twitched near her radio. Then, as if unwilling to let go of her initial judgment, she took a step back and pressed the button. "Dispatch, I need confirmation on a possible stolen vehicle," she said, her voice carrying the weight of an accusation. Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but outwardly he remained composed. This wasn't new. It was just a different setting for a scenario he had witnessed time and time again. Another patrol car pulled up moments later. A second officer stepped out, older with graying hair and a heavy-set frame. As soon as his eyes landed on Michael, his expression shifted. "Judge Carter?" His voice was laced with recognition. "Yes, officer," Michael responded, his tone polite but firm. "I assume there's been a misunderstanding." The senior officer turned to Rowe, his posture rigid. "Rowe, do you have any idea who this is?" She bristled at the question, her fingers flexing at her sides. "He was acting suspicious," she defended, her voice slightly less sure than before. The older officer sighed, rubbing his temple before turning to Michael. "Judge, I sincerely apologize for this mix-up." Michael nodded but didn't respond immediately. He wasn't interested in apologies, at least not the kind that were offered only when someone realized they had misjudged the wrong person. He had seen this before, the quick backpedaling, the attempt to smooth things over once a miscalculation was made. It was never about fairness. It was about avoiding consequences. Meanwhile, Rose stood stiffly, her face hard with frustration. The radio crackled again. "Vehicle registered to Judge Michael Carter. No reports of theft." Michael exhaled slowly, watching as the reality settled over Rowe. Her shoulders squared, her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She had been prepared for control, for compliance, for submission. What she had not been prepared for was an untouchable target. The older officer looked at her pointedly. "You're free to go, Judge Carter." Michael took his license back from Rowe's outstretched hand, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. Their eyes met. Hers burned with resentment. His remained steady, filled with something deeper. "I'll be following up on this," he said smoothly,
a statement rather than a threat. She flinched but didn't respond. As he pulled back onto the road, he saw her reflection in his rearview mirror, standing motionless beside her patrol car, arms crossed, lips pressed together in a thin line of frustration. But Michael knew what truly unsettled her. It wasn't that she had made a mistake.
It was that, for once, her authority had been challenged, and she had lost. And that, more than anything, was why this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a lesson, one that she wouldn't soon forget. Judge Michael Carter had spent his career defending the law, upholding justice, and ensuring fairness in his courtroom. But standing on the side of the road with red and blue lights flashing behind him, he was reminded that justice was often a privilege, not a guarantee. It didn't matter that he had spent years mastering the legal system, that he had built a reputation for fairness and integrity, or that he had fought tirelessly to give others a voice. In this moment, in the eyes of Officer Jennifer Rowe, he was simply a black man behind the wheel of a luxury car. His hands remained firm on the steering wheel, his breathing steady as the weight of the situation settled over him. He had done nothing wrong. He knew that. But knowing didn't matter when authority could be twisted, when power could be abused, when suspicion alone was enough to justify humiliation. The night was quiet except for the hum of traffic in the distance. A hard knock against his window shattered the silence. He turned his head, meeting Officer Rowe's sharp, assessing gaze. There was no courtesy in her expression, no professionalism in her posture, only an unspoken challenge. "License and registration," she demanded. Michael moved deliberately, reaching into his pocket with slow, measured precision. His training told him to comply, to avoid escalation, but there was something infuriating about having to shrink himself, to make himself seem non-threatening, just to avoid giving her an excuse. He handed over the documents and spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" Rowe barely glanced at the documents before replying, her tone laced with thinly veiled hostility. "You were driving a little aggressively back there." Michael's jaw tightened. He had obeyed every traffic law. He had signaled every turn. He had done nothing to warrant suspicion, but he knew the game. This wasn't about traffic violations. This was about control. He watched as Rowe's eyes flickered over his ID, recognition dawning in the way her fingers momentarily hesitated. He saw the brief flicker of surprise before her face hardened again. "Judge Carter," she muttered, as though the title itself was an inconvenience. Michael met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "That's correct." There was a moment of silence, the kind that stretched long enough to make the air feel heavy. He could see her calculating, debating whether to back down or press forward. Her grip on his license tightened slightly, and then, instead of letting the moment de-escalate, she reached for her radio. "Dispatch, I need confirmation on a possible stolen vehicle." Michael exhaled slowly. Of course, it wasn't enough to imply he had been driving recklessly. Now his car itself was in question. It didn't matter that his registration was in order, that his name was clearly printed on the documents she held in her hands. It didn't matter that he had worked for years to afford the very vehicle she was now calling into question. All that mattered was her perception of him, of who she thought he should be. Minutes stretched uncomfortably as another patrol car approached. A second officer stepped out, his uniform slightly disheveled, his face lined with experience. His eyes swept over the scene before landing on Michael. "Judge Carter?" His voice carried the weight of familiarity. "Yes," Michael responded, keeping his tone neutral. "It appears there's been some confusion." The older officer turned to Rowe, his expression unreadable. "Rowe, do you know who this is?" Rowe bristled at the question. "He was acting suspicious," she defended, though her voice lacked the same conviction as before. The older officer sighed, clearly exasperated. He turned back to Michael, nodding once. "Judge, I apologize for this." Michael gave a small nod but said nothing. Apologies were easy. They cost nothing. They didn't undo the humiliation, the quiet degradation of being treated as a criminal first, a man second. The radio crackled again. "Vehicle registered to Judge Michael Carter. No reports of theft." Roe's lips thinned, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. Michael saw it clearly, the frustration of being wrong, the resentment of being challenged. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced of her authority, and yet, in the end, she had nothing. "You're free to go," the older officer said, his tone final. Roe returned Michael's documents with a clipped motion, her gaze burning with something unspoken. He took them without a word, his expression calm but knowing. "I'll be following up on this," he said evenly. She stiffened, but she didn't respond. As he pulled away, he caught her reflection in his rearview mirror. She stood rigid beside her patrol car, her face tight with barely restrained anger. But this wasn't about her. It was about a system that allowed moments like this to happen again and again. Michael knew that had he been anyone else, had his name not carried weight, had there not been another officer willing to recognize him, the night could have ended differently. And that truth was more unsettling than anything Roe had said or done. He adjusted his mirror and kept driving, but he carried the weight of the moment with him. Because this wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about every time he had been questioned, every time someone had assumed he didn't belong, every time another black man had found himself in a similar situation without the privilege of a title to shield him. And that was something he couldn't ignore. Michael Carter sat at his desk, the weight of the previous night settling heavily on his shoulders. He had spent years building his career, fighting for justice in a system that too often failed the very people it was meant to protect. And yet, all it took was one traffic stop to remind him that no matter how high he climbed, there would always be those who saw him as nothing more than a black man who didn't belong. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as he adjusted his tie, his hands steady despite the lingering frustration coursing through him. He had learned long ago how to control his emotions, how to keep his anger contained, how to play the game so that no one could ever accuse him of being irrational or out of line. But last night had tested that control. He replayed the encounter with Officer Roe in his mind, the way she had sneered at him, the way her fingers had hovered just a little too close to her holster, the way she had looked at him and decided in an instant that he didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. It hadn't mattered that he had done nothing wrong, that his registration was valid, that he had obeyed every traffic law. It hadn't even mattered that he was a judge, because to her, he was simply a man in the wrong car, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. A knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. The door creaked open, and his clerk, a young woman with a determined expression, stepped inside. "Judge Carter, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice hesitant. "A police officer." Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Send them in." The door swung open further, and in walked the older officer from the night before. The one who had recognized him, the one who had intervened. Officer James Reynolds. He removed his hat, his expression unreadable as he approached Michael's desk. "Judge Carter," Reynolds said with a respectful nod. "Officer Reynolds," Michael replied, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe the visit?" Reynolds exhaled, his hands tightening around his hat. "I wanted to apologize for what happened last night." Michael studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. "You weren't the one who pulled me over." "No," Reynolds admitted, "but I didn't stop it either. Not soon enough." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. Michael had seen this before. The quiet officers, the ones who didn't instigate, but also didn't intervene until it was convenient. He had spent his career dealing with the aftermath of their silence. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Roe's being investigated for misconduct. Your name carries weight, Judge Carter. When Internal Affairs got word that she'd harassed you, they started pulling her records. Turns out, you weren't the first. Just the first who had enough power to make them listen." Michael felt a familiar bitterness rise in his chest. He had suspected as much. Men like him had been dealing with people like Roe for generations. But too often, their voices were dismissed, their experiences downplayed. It took status, prestige, and undeniable proof for anyone to take notice. And even then, it was never about the injustice itself. It was about the fact that someone important had been caught in the crossfire. Reynolds hesitated before speaking again. For what it's worth, I didn't like what I saw last night. It wasn't right. Michael let out a slow breath, considering his next words carefully. Then why didn't you stop it sooner? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening around his hat. Because I hesitated. Because I didn't want to start something I couldn't finish. Because, if I'm being honest, I've seen too many guys like Rowe get away with worse, and I guess I didn't think this time would be any different. Michael held his gaze. But it was different, and not because of me. Because someone recorded it. Because it went viral. Because the department couldn't afford to ignore it. If I hadn't been a judge, if that camera hadn't been there, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, would we? Reynolds swallowed hard. Probably not. The honesty was refreshing, but it wasn't enough. Apologies were easy. Action was harder. Michael leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. So what are you going to do about it? Reynolds blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? You said you didn't like what you saw, Michael continued. You said it wasn't right. So what are you going to do the next time it happens? Because I guarantee you this isn't the last time you'll see it. Reynolds looked down at his hat, his expression troubled. I don't know, he admitted, but I know I don't want to be the guy who stands by anymore. Michael nodded, his gaze steady. Then don't be. A long silence stretched between them before Reynolds finally nodded. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He wanted to believe that something would change, that this moment had made a difference. But experience had taught him otherwise. Too many people promised to do better, only to fall back into complacency when the moment passed. But still, he had to believe. Because the alternative, the idea that nothing would ever change, was too much to bear. He turned toward the window, watching as the city moved on as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. And whether the system wanted to admit it or not, the tide was beginning to turn. And he was going to make sure it kept turning. Michael Carter stood in his chambers, staring out of the window as the weight of the last 24 hours settled into his bones. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, believing in the power of the law to level the playing field. But last night had been a stark reminder that, no matter how much he had achieved, there would always be those who saw him as nothing more than a black man who didn't belong. He could still hear Officer Rowe's voice in his head, dripping with condescension as she mocked his title, refusing to believe that someone like him could hold power. He had seen that disbelief before, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in whispered conversations that suggested he had been granted success rather than having earned it. The moment he had been pulled over, he had known exactly how the night could end. Wrongfully arrested, humiliated, or worse. But it hadn't ended that way. Not this time. He turned from the window, adjusting his tie, and sat at his desk. The morning news played softly on the television in the corner of his office. His name was everywhere now. Black judge harassed by officer in racially charged traffic stop. The video had gone viral overnight, sparking national outrage. Everyone had an opinion, some condemning Rowe's actions, others defending her, claiming that Michael had been uncooperative. He had learned long ago that, for people like him, there was no correct way to react to injustice. Stay silent, and they call it compliance. Speak up, and they call it aggression. His office door opened, and his clerk stepped in with a cautious expression. Judge Carter, the police chief is here to see you. Michael exhaled slowly, nodding. Send him in. Chief David Holloway entered the room, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. He was a man known for his no-nonsense approach to leadership, someone who prided himself on maintaining order. But Michael wasn't interested in pleasantries. Judge Carter, Holloway said, his voice measured. I wanted to speak with you personally about what happened last night. Michael gestured to the chair across from him, and Holloway sat down. There was a pause before the chief finally spoke again. We're placing Officer Rowe on immediate suspension pending investigation. Michael studied him carefully. Is that all? Holloway's jaw tightened slightly. For now. Michael let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. For now, he repeated. Tell me, Chief, if I had been just another black man without a title, without a platform, would we even be having this conversation? Holloway hesitated for a beat too long. I'd like to think we would. Michael held his gaze. But we wouldn't, because it happens every day. The only difference is, this time, people were watching. Holloway sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, Judge Carter, I won't pretend the system is perfect. But I also won't pretend that one bad officer represents my entire department. She doesn't, Michael agreed. But she's not an isolated case either. You and I both know that if we pulled her record, we'd find a pattern. And if we looked at complaints in your department, we'd see how many times officers like her have been protected, how many times their behavior has been excused, how many times men like me have had to bite their tongues and just get through it. Holloway's expression darkened. So what do you want me to do? Michael leaned forward, his voice unwavering. I want you to do your job. I want you to stop protecting officers who abuse their power. I want you to stop waiting until someone important gets mistreated before you take action. I want real reform, not just damage control. The chief exhaled, shaking his head. You know it's not that simple. It is, Michael said, his voice sharp. It's only complicated because people like you make it that way. Holloway sat in silence for a long moment, then finally nodded. I'll personally oversee the investigation. And if what we find is as bad as I suspect, Roe won't just be suspended. She'll be fired. Michael leaned back, watching him. That's a start. Holloway stood, adjusting his belt. For what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened to you. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't need an apology. I need change. The chief gave a slow nod before turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, Michael exhaled, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. He knew better than to believe that justice would come easily. He had spent his life pushing against a system that resisted change at every turn. But this time, the world was watching. And he wasn't going to let it look away. He reached for his phone, scrolling through the flood of messages from colleagues, activists, reporters. They all wanted a statement, a comment, something they could use to shape the narrative. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. Michael Carter sat in his office, his fingers pressed together in deep thought. The events of the past few days had played out in front of the entire country. His name had been dragged into the national conversation, his experience dissected by journalists, commentators, and social media users. Some hailed him as a symbol of resilience, while others questioned why he hadn't simply complied more quickly, as if submission was the price he had to pay to be treated with dignity. He had spent his career fighting for justice, but now, he found himself at the center of a battle that was much bigger than him. His phone vibrated on the desk, a message from an old colleague. Michael, the department is going into full damage control mode. Be ready. He didn't need the warning. He knew how these things worked. Officer Roe's misconduct wasn't just a problem for her. It was a liability for the entire police force. The department had a choice: hold her accountable or sweep the issue under the rug and protect their own. But Michael had no intention of letting them take the easy way out. He had seen too many cases like this before. He had presided over trials where officers had used their authority as a weapon, where victims had been gaslighted into believing they had provoked their own mistreatment. The system wasn't designed to protect people like him. It was designed to protect itself. And yet, here he was, with the rare opportunity to force that system to confront its own failures. There was a knock at the door. His assistant stepped in, her expression tense. Judge Carter, the mayor wants to speak with you. He's on line 3. Michael took a deep breath and picked up the receiver. Mayor Kingston. Judge Carter, the mayor's voice was measured, cautious. First, let me say that what happened to you was unacceptable. No one should be treated that way, least of all a federal judge. Least of all? Michael repeated, his tone calm but sharp. So it would be acceptable if I had been someone else? That's not what I meant, the mayor said quickly. Look, I called because the city is under pressure. This case has made national headlines. We can't afford a scandal like this to shake public trust in our law enforcement. Michael let out a quiet laugh. So you want to manage the optics? I want to find a solution, the mayor corrected. We're looking into disciplinary action for Officer Rowe and... Looking into? Michael interrupted. This isn't complicated, Mayor Kingston. There's video evidence. She profiled me, escalated without cause, and put her hands on me without justification. If you're looking into discipline, then you're already failing to take this seriously. The mayor sighed on the other end of the line. Judge Carter, you're a respected figure in this city. We don't want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be. Michael felt a slow burn in his chest. He had heard those words before. They were always used to pacify, to convince people to stay quiet and not rock the boat. It already is bigger than me, he said evenly. It always has been. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, the mayor spoke again. What do you want? Michael leaned forward, gripping the receiver tightly. I want accountability. I want real change, not just a PR stunt. I want Officer Rowe off the force, and I want an independent review of the department's history of racial profiling. You're asking for a lot, the mayor said. No, Michael countered. I'm asking for the bare minimum. Another silence. Then the mayor sighed. I'll see what I can do. You'll do more than that, Michael said. Because if you don't, I'll make sure this conversation is part of the public record. The line went dead. Michael set the phone down, exhaling slowly. He knew this fight wasn't over. The system was built to resist change, to protect those in power. But he had a platform now, and he wasn't going to waste it. If they thought they could silence him with empty promises, they were mistaken. As he looked at the stack of legal briefs on his desk, he realized something. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black man who had been pulled over for no reason, every person who had been treated like a suspect before being seen as a human being. He had spent his life upholding the law. Now, he had to fight to make sure it upheld him, too. The morning light spilled through Michael Carter's office window, casting long shadows across his desk. He sat there, his fingers lightly drumming against the polished wood, his mind running through the events of the past few days. The weight of the situation was undeniable. The world now knew what had happened that night, how an officer had seen him, a black man in a nice car, and assumed criminality before humanity. The video had spread across the country, sparking conversations about racial profiling, systemic abuse, and the quiet indignities that people like him had been forced to endure for generations. But he knew how these things worked. Outrage burned hot, but it burned fast. The public's attention was fickle, shifting with the news cycle. The real battle wasn't in the headlines, it was in the aftermath. Would this moment be another footnote in the long history of injustice, or could it be something more? That was the question Michael found himself facing. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. A message from a longtime friend and fellow judge, Lisa Whitman. They want to settle this quietly. Be careful. He wasn't surprised. The city officials would do anything to protect their own, to smooth over the rough edges of this scandal, before it could cause lasting damage. Officer Rowe was a liability now, but that didn't mean they wanted real justice. They wanted closure, not accountability. There was a sharp knock at his office door before it swung open. His assistant, Evelyn, stepped inside, her expression tight with concern. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." "The police commissioner." Michael nodded. "Send him in." A moment later, Commissioner Bradley stepped into the office, his uniform crisp, his expression carefully neutral. He was a man who had spent decades navigating the complexities of politics and policing, someone who knew how to say a lot without saying anything at all. "Judge Carter," Bradley said, extending a hand. Michael took it, but his grip was firm, his gaze unwavering. "Commissioner," he replied. "What can I do for you?" Bradley sighed, settling into the chair across from him. I won't waste your time. This situation has become complicated. Michael allowed a small, humorless smile. Complicated? That's an interesting way to describe an officer violating my rights on the side of the road. Bradley held up a hand. Look, I'm not here to defend what happened. What Officer Rowe did was unacceptable. But the department is under fire. We're trying to handle this in a way that won't further erode trust. Michael leaned back, arms crossed. Erode trust? Commissioner, let me tell you something about trust. It isn't given. It's earned. And your department has spent years making sure people like me have every reason not to give it. Bradley's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. The mayor wants to make this right. Then fire her, Michael said, his tone even. Fire her, and open an independent investigation into racial profiling in the department. Bradley exhaled sharply. That's not how these things work. There are procedures, union protections. And where were those protections when she decided to drag me out of my car? Michael interrupted. Where was due process when she decided I didn't belong? The commissioner said nothing. He didn't have an answer, and they both knew it. Michael continued, his voice controlled but firm. I have spent my life upholding the law. I believe in it. But belief isn't enough. The law has to be enforced fairly, and right now it isn't. If you truly care about public trust, you'll stop trying to minimize what happened and start dealing with the real problem. Bradley looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, almost to himself. You're not backing down. No, Michael said simply. I'm not. Bradley stood. I'll take your demands to the mayor. You do that, Michael said, and tell him I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for every person who's ever been pulled over and treated like a suspect just for existing. As Rowe was escorted out, the weight in Michael's chest did not lift. One verdict could not erase decades of injustice. One ruling could not undo the harm that had been inflicted on people who would never see their day in court. But it was a step, a beginning, a statement that the old rules were no longer untouchable. As he stood to leave, he caught sight of the young man who had filmed the video that night, the one who had refused to look away, who had refused to be silent. Their eyes met, and for the first time that day, Michael allowed himself a small nod of acknowledgement. Because this fight was far from over. But at least, today, justice had been served. Judge Michael Carter sat in his office, staring out the window at the towering skyline that stretched before him. The weight of the trial still lingered in his mind, pressing against him like an invisible force. The case of Officer Rebecca Rowe had been more than just another ruling. It had been a reckoning, a moment that exposed the fractures in a system that had too often protected those who wielded power rather than those who suffered under it. For years, he had worked within the law, believing that justice, though imperfect, could still be achieved. But that night, the flashing red and blue lights, the rough hands pushing him against his own car, the mocking disbelief when he stated his title, had been a stark reminder that his position did not shield him from the reality of being a black man in America. Even with a lifetime of accomplishment, the assumption had been immediate. He did not belong. That thought haunted him as he reflected on the outcome of the trial. The courtroom had been silent when he delivered his ruling. Rebecca Rowe, stripped of her badge, barred from law enforcement for life. The moment had been powerful, but it had not felt like victory. Not entirely. He knew that removing one bad officer would not erase the culture that had allowed her to operate unchecked. It was a symptom of something much larger, a disease that had festered in the justice system for generations. He had seen it firsthand in the cases he presided over. Black men receiving harsher sentences for the same crimes as their white counterparts, families torn apart by wrongful convictions, the unshakable assumption of guilt before innocence. His case had been different only because he had power. He had a voice that could not be ignored. He had a title that made headlines. But what about those who did not? What about the men who had been pulled over and never made it home? What about the people who were not believed, whose lives had been stolen by a justice system that was supposed to protect them? Michael's fingers drummed against his desk as he exhaled deeply. The image of the young man who had filmed the entire encounter flashed in his mind, the determination in his voice as he stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "This is racial profiling, and we all know it," he had said, his phone steady in his grip. That video had changed everything. Without it, there would have been no outrage, no investigation, no trial. That realization settled into Michael's bones like ice. How many others had been stopped just like he had, but without a camera to capture the truth? How many had been handcuffed, humiliated, or worse, without the chance to fight back? He had always believed in the law. He had built his life around it, convinced that justice could be found within its rules. But the law, he now understood, was only as strong as those who enforced it. And when those in power chose to wield it as a weapon rather than a shield, justice became nothing more than an illusion. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant stepped inside, holding out a folder. "The governor's office called," she said. "They want to schedule a meeting with you regarding police reform policies." Michael took the folder, flipping through the contents. This was it, the opportunity to do more than just issue rulings, to change the system from within. "Set the meeting," he said firmly. As his assistant left, he leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through the next steps. Policy changes, training reforms, increased accountability for officers who abused their authority. He had spent years watching the system fail people like him. It was time to make sure it worked for them instead. His phone buzzed, a notification lighting up the screen. It was a message from the young man who had recorded the video. "Thank you for what you did in court today, but we both know this isn't over. Let me know how I can help." Michael smiled slightly, typing out his response. "It's just the beginning." As he hit send, he felt something shift. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. This was about every black man who had ever been told he didn't belong, every person who had been denied justice, every life that had been shattered by a system designed to silence them. He had the power to change that, and he intended to use it. The story of Judge Michael Carter is more than just a shocking moment of racial profiling. It is a mirror reflecting the harsh realities that many black Americans face daily. It is a reminder that no matter how accomplished, how law-abiding, or how highly ranked a black man may be, there are still those who will only see his skin before they see his humanity. His encounter with Officer Rebecca Rowe was not just an isolated incident, but part of a deeply ingrained problem that has persisted for generations. Yet, this story is also about something else: resilience, accountability, and the power of taking a stand. Judge Carter could have walked away from that night, shaken but silent, letting his position shield him while ignoring those who weren't as fortunate. But he didn't. He fought, not just for himself, but for every person who had been stopped, searched, and humiliated simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. His actions proved that justice is not just about words spoken in a courtroom. It is about holding power accountable and refusing to accept injustice as the status quo. One of the most powerful moments of his story wasn't just the courtroom ruling, but the presence of a young man who dared to speak up. In a world where so many cases of police misconduct go unnoticed, that single phone camera became a weapon of truth. It became a force that disrupted the silence. It is a reminder that every voice matters, every action counts, and that change begins when people refuse to turn away. But let's be clear, this is not just about one bad cop. This is about a system that has allowed countless officers to act without consequence. Officer Rowe lost her badge, but how many more like her remain? How many officers continue to harass, detain, and mistreat black citizens simply because they believe they can? This story highlights something we all need to understand. Real change does not come from isolated victories, but from systemic reform. It requires policy changes, stronger accountability measures, and a society that refuses to be complacent. Judge Carter did his part in the courtroom, but it's up to all of us to do our part in everyday life. We must demand transparency, push for justice, and most importantly, support those who are fighting for change. So, What can we learn from this? First, never assume that injustice is someone else's fight. If Judge Carter, a federal judge, can be treated this way, then what happens to those without power, without a title, without a platform? Second, use your voice. The young man who recorded the incident changed the course of the story. You never know when your actions could be the difference between silence and justice. And finally, keep pushing forward. One case, one firing, one courtroom ruling is not enough. We must remain vigilant, continue to challenge corruption, and ensure that we are building a future where justice applies equally to all. If you believe in justice, if you stand against racial profiling, and if you know that the fight isn't over, then take action. Share this story. Speak out against injustice when you see it. And most importantly, subscribe to Civil Rights Fight, where we continue to shed light on the truth, hold power accountable, and demand the justice that every person deserves. Because justice isn't just about punishment, it's about change.